بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. هذه المحاضرة مسجلة من الكتاب. We'll talk about early Victorian novelist, and the differences between them. The Victorian novel and its two phases. A novel in the Victorian era is so abundant and prolific that it's usual to divide the Victorian novelist into early Victorian novelist and the later Victorian novelist. According to Walter Allen, in this connection and context, William Thackeray was born in 1800, Charles Dickens was born in 1812, Trollope was born in 1815, Charlotte Bronte was born in 1816, Emily Bronte in 1818, George Eliot in 1819, Mrs. Gaskell had been born in 1810, and lesser novelists born in the Regency period include Charles Reed, Charles Kingsley. Together, they are the names that came to mind when we think of the Victorian novel. They don't form a coherent body, and Emily Bronte will prove an exception to all generalization we care to make about the rest of them. So when we talk about the novel in the Victorian era, it is abundant and prolific. For that reason, it is called the golden era for novel writing. We have many Victorian novelists, and for this reason, we divide them into early Victorian novelists and later Victorian novelists. When we talk about early Victorian novelists, people who wrote from 1837 up to middle 1850, people who wrote after 1850, we call them later Victorian novelists. So when we talk about Thackeray, Dickens, Trollope, Charlotte Bronte, Emily Bronte, George Eliot, Mrs. Gaskell, all these were Victorian novelists. But people who wrote before 1850, we call them early Victorian novelists, like Charles Dickens, like Charlotte Bronte, Emily Bronte, Anna Bronte. But people like George Eliot, Thomas Hardy, we call them later novelists. Yet, if we sit them beside the cheap novelist born in the generation after the Regency, Samuel Butler, 1835, George Meredith, Thomas Hardy, and Henry James, we shall see that they have much more in common with one another than they have with the younger men. What they have in common is a special climate of ideas and feelings, a set of fundamental assumptions. It was this special climate, these assumptions that the later novelists of the century were to question. Even the great mass of reading public still took them for granted. So when we have later novelists like Samuel Butler, George Meredith, Thomas Hardy, and Henry James, we find that they have a common ground together. They share the same ideas, they share the same beliefs, and they have a special climate of ideas and feelings regarding fundamental assumption, issues, and topics. It was this special climate, these assumptions, that the latter of the novelists were to question, examine, and probe, even though the great mass of reading public still took them for granted. They did not take them, the mass of readers did not take them seriously, but after a while, they discovered the importance of their writings. So we go back to the early Victorian novelist. We talk about Emily Bronte, and we talk about George Eliot. We talk about Mrs. Gaskell, and lesser novelists born in Regency period include Charles Reed, Charles Kingsley, together with they are the name that first came to mind. They are the name that first came to mind. إذا الرواية الفكتورية تنقسم إلى فترتين، فترة الروائيين الفكتوريين الأوائل وفترة الروائيين الفكتوريين الأواخر. الأوائل الذين ولدوا قبل عام 1850 وكتاباتهم كانت كتابات مبكرة، وعندنا تشارلز ديكنز، ترولوب، شارلوت برونت، إيميلي برونت، جورج إيليت، ونطلع على تواريخ ميلادهم ومسز غاسكل. وهناك كمان روائيين مغمورين we call them lesser novelists. lesser novelists. And when we talk about later Victorian novelists, هنا نتكلم عن الروائيين الفكتوريين الأواخر، أن سامويل باتلر، جورج ميرديث، توماس هاردي، and هنري جيمس، وهؤلاء كتبوا بعد فترة الريجنسي. سنرى أن أفكارهم متشابهة مترابطة ولهم نفس الخلفية من الأفكار، وكانوا يشاركون في نفس الانتقادات للمؤسسات المجتمعية وفحص كل المواضيع ومناقشتها، وعدم أخذ أي شيء على سجيته. وبالرغم من أن القراء لم ينظروا إليهم بطريقة جدية إلا بعد فترة من الزمن اكتشفوا أهمية كتاباتهم. Differences. At this point to another main difference between novelists of the first half of the Victorian age and those of the second half. The former were at one with their public to a quite remarkable degree. They were conditioned by it, as of course any novelist must be, but for the most part were willingly conditioned by it. They identified themselves with their age and were its spokesmen. They may criticize their age, as do Dickens and Thackeray, but on the whole they accept the prevalent custom and social institution. So they depict and present the conditions of their time, the problems, but they were not critical of the social, political, and economic stages. Maybe they may criticize their age, they criticize the prevalent conditions, but they don't challenge them. And as happened with Dickens and Thackeray, but on the whole, they accept the prevalent custom and social institution. إذا الخلافات والاختلافات بين الروائيين الفكتوريين المبكرين والأواخر أن الروائيين الفكتوريين الأوائل التصقوا بمجتمعهم، عبروا عن مشاكل المجتمع الفكتوري في بدايته، ولكن لم يتحدوا المؤسسات السياسية والاجتماعية وقبلوا بهذه الأوضاع، بالرغم من أنهم صوروها وصوروا هذه المشاكل وكانوا متحدثين باسم العصر الفكتوري في بدايته، ولكن لم يشكلوا تهديد وتحديد انتقاد صارخ للمؤسسات السياسية وللأعراف السياسية الاقتصادية والاجتماعية، بل كان دورهم ممثل وناطق وتصوير لهذه الأوضاع. هذا هو الخلاف الجذري بين الروائيين الفكتوريين الأوائل والأواخر. نطلع هون على الأواخر. The later novelists were writing in some sense against their age. They were critical, even hostile to its dominant assumption. Thus Hardy attacks Victorian morality and institution of marriage. Samuel Butler scandalized his age by flouting Victorian taboos and conventions, and Henry James went against the literary canons of the age by the advocacy of the novel as an art form. George Eliot novels reflect the rationalism of the age. The relation of these novels to reading public was nearer to that of the 20th century novelists than that of the early Victorian. So when we talk about the later novelists, they were writing against their age, they were aggressive, they were critical, they were even hostile to its dominant assumption, customs, very critical of the political, economic, and social institution. The third attacks Victorian morality and institution of marriage, like Samuel Butler scandalized his age by flouting, criticizing Victorian taboos and conventions. Henry James went against the literary canons of the age by his advocacy of the novel as an art form. George Eliot novels reflect the rationalism of the age, and they were closer to the 20th century novelists than that of the early Victorian. إذا الروائيين الفكتوريين الأواخر لقد هاجموا الأخلاق الفكتورية مؤسسة الزواج، ولقد انتقدوا القيود الفكتورية والعادات الفكتورية. هنري جيمس انتقد الرواية كفن أدبي وكوسيلة أدبية تحتاج إلى تغيير ودواتها تحتاج إلى تغيير. جورج إليوت كانت عبرت عن عقلانية العصر وعن عقلانية العصر في رواياتها، فنرى بأن الروائيين الفكتوريين الأواخر قريبين للروائيين في القرن العشرين وروائيين الحداثة أكثر من الروائيين الفكتوريين الأوائل. يكون هيك تكلمنا عن روائيين فيكتوريين الأوائل المبكرين والأواخر والاختلاف بينهم ومين هم. إذا عجبتكم هذه المحاضرة تنسوش اللايك وتنسوش الاشتراك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.